Tonight I'm going to be talking about one of the most famous root workers, if not the most famous root worker that you may have never heard of. But before I get into it, it's my new series, At the Root, which is a spin-off of my Black Witch Month series, except this series allows me to properly focus on those practitioners who wouldn't fall under the umbrella of witch. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't have supernatural abilities or gifts, but it does mean that they are not considered witches within the practice that they belong to. Now back to the video. So if you thought I was talking about Ernest Bratton, famously known as Dr. Buzzard, you would be incorrect. Now, I am talking about a Dr. Buzzard, but Dr. Buzzard is a popular moniker worn by a number of hoodoo practitioners, but there can only really be one, and the one I'm referring to is Stephany Robinson. Now, some sources say Stephen Robinson, but I definitely think it's Stephany, so that's what I'm going to be referring to him as in this video. And Stephany, aka Dr. Buzzard, is known as the original OG Dr. Buzzard. In fact, Ernest Bratton, the second most famous Dr. Buzzard, is likely an observer of the original Dr. Buzzard's practices. Now, unfortunately, for the purposes of this video, I wasn't able to find a good picture of Dr. Buzzard to use here, so I did pick a photo of a gentleman from that time frame, but just know, this is in fact not Dr. Buzzard. But anyways, let's get into our story. So our story for the evening takes us back to around 1860 or 1885 South Carolina, to the island of St. Helena. Now, of course, birthdays during this time were going to be skewed. Same with Aunt Caroline Dye. They're kind of all over the place. So Dr. Buzzard, aka Stephany Robinson, was born between 1860 and 1885. This means that at the earliest, Dr. Buzzard would have been alive during the last few years of the enslavement. At the latest, though, he would have been born in Reconstruction era America. Both of those times would suck for him. So anyways, he was born to an enslaved father who was known to be a very powerful root worker and conjurman himself. Now, one of the more interesting things about his father's background was that although the trafficking of African peoples to the US at the time was outlawed, he managed to find his way over here, which means they were definitely still doing it. But it's also said, according to some sources, that not only was Dr. Buzzard's father a very powerful conjurman himself and root worker, his grandfather was as well, which is really cool to me because this means that it came right through his paternal line. His grandfather gave it to his father was known to be insanely powerful, and he passed down that knowledge and those abilities to his son, which is eventually something that Dr. Buzzard would gain notoriety for, and this is something that would draw people from all over the country to seek his services. Like I mentioned, Dr. Buzzard had a number of abilities, all of which he excelled at. He could heal people, he cast hexes, he did root work, he was a conjurman, but the thing he was most famously known for was chewing the root. Now, if you look at this card here, you might see the scales of justice here in the bottom right corner. And this is because Dr. Buzzard has a very specific inclination towards being able to do root work in the law. Now, if you found yourself needing this particular service from Dr. Buzzard, I'm going to explain how it might go. Now, let's assume you were on trial. You go to the courthouse, and then you have Dr. Buzzard. You're on trial, we'll say you're African American, but you don't always have to be, you could be anything. Remember, Dr. Buzzard, much like Aunt Caroline, attracted clientele from everywhere. So you could just be going to court for any number of things, but this is what Dr. Buzzard would do. He would go to your court case, he would sit in the courtroom, and he would be chewing on something in the back. This could be any number of things, but he would be back there chewing loud as shit, almost distractingly so. He would look at the jury, and then he would look at the witnesses, and all the while he would just be in the back of the room chewing loudly. Now, there were a number of things he could be chewing on, different roots obviously, but he would chew so loud, and the witnesses who may or may not have been coached, or the stories they were telling may or may not have been true, didn't matter. It was inconsequential when Dr. Buzzard was in the courtroom, because whatever he was chewing on often made them freeze up. Whatever it was he was doing in that courtroom prevented them from being able to give their testimony, their facts, whatever they wanted to do. It didn't matter if it was real or not real, true or not true. They could not utter a word on the stand in some cases. Other times they would just stumble. But whatever the case might be, an ineffective witness and an ineffective jury would often lead to that person that was contracted by Dr. Buzzard to walk away scot-free. And this is something that would get him into a little bit of trouble. Now, like I mentioned, Dr. Buzzard's reputation attracted a lot of people from all over the place, those seeking his services. But it also undermined a very important system that was prevalent and dangerous in the US at the time, the police state that was burgeoning in the US. Remember, this is Reconstruction era, post Reconstruction era, and the fact that you have this African American man exercising some unknown ability to get people off obviously pissed off the police force, in particular Ed McTeer, also known as the High Sheriff.